Okay, welcome. Thank you very much for being here this afternoon. My name is Reese Peterson. I am the director of the Student Engagement Project here at UNL, based at the Barkley Center. And we are attempting to develop some materials for Nebraska that would support school-based teams to improve their school discipline and also to support school completion of students. So we have been developing a series of strategy briefs that provide schools with information, a menu of options of strategies for schools to choose to build a school-based plan to improve and reduce the kids that are suspended or expelled, and to also prevent dropout and increase school completion. So as a result of that project, which is funded by the Nebraska Department of Education, we have also connected with the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities, and I get the honor here of introducing Dr. Matt Klare from that center, who will be talking with you today about the project we have been engaged in with him and with Goodrich Middle School here in Lincoln. Before I do that, I want to at least mention Adria Bass and Lindy Foley sitting up here from the Nebraska Department of Education, and 3 of my 4 graduate student assistants who are involved in the project here. They're here. And also thank Sherry Jones, my department chair, for her support on this project. I'm going to introduce Dr. Klare and let him explain the current status of dropout and how that has been applied to our project here at Goodrich Middle School. Dr. Klare joined the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities in 2005. But before that, he was at the American Institutes for Research doing a variety of things in areas related to special education. But most recently, his focus has been on dropout, and he works with the state departments of education to support them in meeting the needs of kids in those states all across the United States. I want to now introduce Dr. Matt Klare.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, actually I'm a paleobotanist by training. My Ph.D. is in paleoecology and paleobotany and palynology, and then I did state assessment and a variety of other large-scale assessment stuff for about 18 years. And then I got sick of commuting from DC to South Carolina, so I moved to the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities. And we say NDPC-SD because the name is so long, otherwise you can't get it out in one breath. So I'm going to talk about dropout a little bit. Talk about who drops out, why they drop out of school, a little bit about the costs to the person who drops out and to the community and society and everyone else. I'll talk a bit about what we're doing at Goodrich, talk about the data-based approach we're taking, and show you a couple of tools. One is a building level tool, and another is a risk calculator, which is being used at Goodrich right now. We're checking that out. And then talk about a couple of the strategies and interventions we've come across that seem to have some merit. One of the problems in dropout prevention, particularly for kids with disabilities, is that there's not a lot of really high quality research-based stuff. So if you look for interventions that have a solid research base behind them, you don't find much. There's check and connect, basically. But other than that, there's not a heck of a lot. So a lot of the stuff I'm telling you about, or will tell you about, is not gold standard research, because there isn't that much. But it's been shown, it seems to be quite effective. It's promising practice level, I guess you'd call it. So anyway, we're the National Dropout Prevention Center for Students with Disabilities. We're at Clemson, down in South Carolina. We're a Fed-funded, OSEP-funded grant. The Office of Special Ed Programs at the Department of Education funds us. We've been in business since January of 2004. We've got a 5-year cooperative agreement with the feds. We got that renewed in 2009, and we're slated to end at the end of this calendar year, but we were just extended to run through the end of September of 2014. because of some fiscal maneuvering that the feds are doing. So I'll be around at least until then. Our mission or our purpose or whatever you want to call it is to help states and LEAs improve school completion, dropout rates, graduation rates, re-entry, re-engagement rates of kids with disabilities. Since we are funded by OSEP, the Office of Special Ed Programs, our focus is on kids with disabilities. However, most of the stuff we come across and most of the work we do generalizes pretty nicely to all kids. So if you look at dropout rates, the event dropout rate in 2009-10 was 3.4% for all U.S. high school kids. And the event rate is basically the number of kids who dropped out that year divided by the number of kids in high school that year. So it is usually a lot lower than some of the rates that actually count the number of kids, kid by kid, the so-called cohort rates. Those generally come out a little higher than these. If you look at the numbers for kids with disabilities, last year the numbers ranged between 0 and 41.6%. So pretty big spread. The difference between the 0 and the 41 can be attributed to a number of things. One is that there are a bunch of different ways of calculating dropout rates. The cohort rate, which gives you a pretty high rate, the event rate, which gives you a pretty low rate. But this is for the states and all the territories. And some of the territories have very, very, very low ends, very few kids. So if one kid drops out of school, that can kick them up by 10% conceivably. So there was one territory that didn't have any kids drop out last year out of their 15 or something. So they had a 0% rate. If you look at the number of kids between 18 and 24 who were neither employed nor in school, that was 15% of all young adults in 2006. There were about 3.8 million kids who were neither in school nor employed. That number's going up. It keeps going up. It's probably this slide is a little bit old. It's probably up to 5 million by now. In the 4 years between 2000 and 2004, that number went up by 700,000. And with the crummy economy and such, it's not going to get better very quickly. The odds are good it's probably going to get worse. So we've got a huge amount of work to do. If you look at kids who drop out, what are they like? Most of them skip school a lot. They miss 10 or more days. Very few of them are doing activities in school. They're not engaged in school. A lot of them didn't like school. There's a surprise. A lot of them were not doing well academically. They failed a bunch of classes, 3 to 5 classes. So they were credit deficient. They probably weren't on track to graduate anyway. In fact, they were very likely quite far off track to graduate. Most of them, or many of them at least, were retained 1 or more years, and that one of those years could have been their 9th grade year. They could have been repeat freshmen and given up that second freshman year. Most of them got between 5 and 9 disciplinary referrals, so they were getting into trouble for one reason or another. Maybe because they were late, maybe because they were having behavior issues, who knows what. A lot of them were identified in middle school for not being on track. They weren't doing well academically. And a lot of them just didn't come back after their freshman year. So if you look at the kids who dropped out, you see a lot of dropouts among kids with disabilities. Their dropout rate is almost twice that of their non-disabled peers. So of those kids with disabilities, you get a lot of specific learning disabilities kids and kids with emotional behavior disorders. You get a lot of kids from minority backgrounds, American Indians, African American kids drop out a lot. Hispanic kids seem to drop out a lot. Asian kids and white kids drop out the least. If you look at kids in 9th grade, they have a pretty high incidence of dropping out because they're basically making the transition from middle school to high school, and things are considerably different between those two spots. When they're in 8th grade, they're kind of the top of the heap socially and the boss, and when they get to 9th grade, they're peons, and they're treated like peons probably by their older peers. There's also a lot more expectation on these kids academically and socially and stuff. So High school is different. It's harder for them. A lot of them just can't deal with it and they drop out. Kids in poverty tend to drop out more than more affluent kids. A lot of that's tied to mobility. If families are moving from one side of the county line to the other side, back and forth and so on, or moving from one part of the country to another for work or for whatever reason, they tend not to be engaged in school. They don't know their peers, the teachers don't know them, they don't know the school system very well, they may not know the town, they don't have any friends, and it's really easy for these kids of mobile parents to sort of get lost in the shuffle and fall through the cracks, and they drop out, and nobody even knows it. And finally, boys drop out more often than girls. If you look at poverty and level of educational attainment, 21% of the people who have a BA or higher, this is looking at 16 to 24-year-old kids who are members of low-income families. And you look at their educational attainment. People with a BA or higher, only 21% were living in poverty. On the other hand, if you look at the other end of that scale, of the kids who are high school dropouts, 58% living in poverty. So there's a fairly stark difference. So think about why people drop out of school. There are a couple of reasons. Push effects and pull effects. I don't know if you've heard of them, but they're sort of self-explanatory. Push effects come from within the school. Things in the school that cause a kid to feel the need to drop out or make them want to drop out. They can be policies in school that force the kid out. They can be not getting along with their peers, not getting along with their teachers. They can often run into academic issues. Schools frequently raise their standards, and a lot of times a school district will have higher academic standards than the state does, and that has negative impact on kids. It's more work for them to do, more credits for them to attain. Particularly for kids with disabilities, it gets even harder and harder as you crank up the expectations. School safety is a big thing in some communities. If the kids don't feel safe in school, or they're getting beaten up, or getting shot at, or whatever other horrible stuff is happening to them, that will push them out of school. Getting into disciplinary issues, suspension, expulsion, that kind of thing. Certainly expulsion, but suspension can be a push factor. So there are a bunch of things internal to the school that can push kids out. On the other hand, there are pull effects, things outside of the school that basically make it necessary for a kid to drop out of school. For example, their parent gets sick or they get sick. They have to stay home and take care of a sick sibling. If their parent loses a job, they may have to get a job. If they're young parents, they may have to get a job to take care of their kids. So there are a lot of things that can pull a kid out of school as well. So we can't say that there's one thing and every kid has this thing in common. There are sort of a pool of things that a lot of these dropouts have in common, but there are a bunch of different reasons for which people drop out of school. And it's not a sudden thing necessarily. It's very often a gradual process, and that process can start as early as elementary school. So this is one major reason that early interventions pay off. The sooner you can recognize that a child has some sort of a characteristic that is going to increase their likelihood of dropping out of school, and you can address whatever it is, the more likely it is you can help that child stay in school and actually make it through and do well. If you look at some of the data, first grade teachers, you're looking at aggression, and kids who are highly aggressive. In first grade, that was predictive of dropout. In third grade, you looked at attendance. 66% of the time you could predict correctly whether a third grader would be a dropout several years down the road. If you look at reading, reading is another, like third grade reading is another fairly good predictor. If a kid is not doing well reading in third grade, their likelihood of dropping out is higher than that of a kid who reads really well in third grade. So early reading programs are really good, early literacy programs are good. So anyway, there are a number of factors you can look at when children are really small, and you can say, we got to help this kid. So that's sort of one of my big interests, is looking at these predictive things and saying how can we help schools identify kids and get them the appropriate sets of interventions and supports that will help them succeed. More reasons why kids drop out. Attendance is often an issue. Tardiness is an issue. Academics, low credit accrual, difficulty based on their disability. I mean, kids without disabilities have a hard enough time getting through school. If you throw in a disability to the mix, it can often get overwhelming. Relationship problems, peers or adults. If you don't get along well, it's very hard to want to be in school. Mobility, as I said before. Low interest in engagement. If the kid doesn't feel like he or she belongs in the school community, doesn't feel known, isn't connected to the school, doesn't have any sense of really belonging, it's really a lot easier to simply drop out than to stay around. Dropping out becomes considerably easier. Failure. If you have to take algebra a couple of times, or God forbid 3 times, I mean, think about it. You don't like doing something, or you're not doing well at something. How easy is it to keep doing it over and over again and failing at it? After not a terribly long time, you go, forget it, I'm not going to do this. This is miserable. So, look at the risk factors. There's been a bunch of research. Ruth Neal, Bob Balfons, and Herzog have done some. Allensworth and Easton have done some up in Chicago. This stuff I'm showing you here is based mainly in Philadelphia, but also they've done a bunch of work around, I think, DC, Baltimore area. 6th grade, things that are predictive of dropout. Failing math and failing English class. Crummy attendance, below 80% attendance. And some behavior issues, at least one poor behavior mark. Those are the main factors that indicate a kid's at risk of dropping out, or will be at risk of dropping out in a while. By 8th grade, if you look at failing math, failing English, or attending less than 80% of the time, one of those factors gives you at least a 75% chance of dropping out. If you've got all 3 of those factors, it's not quite you're not quite nailed into the coffin, but you're quite close. You're really in need of some serious help. When you look at 9th grade, credit deficiency, having fewer than 2 credits after 9th grade, not being promoted to 10th grade, and attending less than 70% of the time are the major predictors of future dropout. Crazy stuff. So Balfons and Ruth and Herzog looked at a bunch of kids who went to school in their study. They found that kids who failed math, of those kids who failed math, only 21% of them graduated on time, if at all. Of the kids who failed English, it was 16%. Of the kids who had bad attendance, only 14% graduated on time. Because if you're not there in class to get the instruction, you don't learn the material, you don't do well in school, you don't do well, you don't pass your classes, you don't get the credits, and lo and behold, you're suddenly whatever age and you have 2 credits, and you're not going to graduate. Kids with bad behavior, 17% graduated on time. This is Allensworth and Easton, folks from Chicago, looked at attendance in graduation, or actually non-attendance in graduation. This is the number of days that the kid skipped school, or the kids skipped school. And this is the percent of the group that they looked at that actually graduated in 4 years, so all on time. So kids who didn't skip school, like 0 to 4 days, basically not skipping school, 87% of those kids got out on time in 4 years. 5 to 9 days knocked that down to 63%. Missing 10 to 14 days, and this is per semester. Missing 10 to 14 days per semester, cut the rate in half. And it just gets worse from there.
But guys, look at that in that 5 to 9.
Yeah, it's a big jump. So that's 10 to 18 days per year, effectively.
Oh,
These are per semester. These are per semester.
Yeah, got to think about. Okay.
But still, I mean, that's 5 days is a week. If you've got the crud for a week, your likelihood of graduation gets knocked down because you missed that much material. So what happens to people who drop out? Generally bad stuff. They are frequently unemployed or at least underemployed. They tend to have a higher rate of unexpected parenthood, and a lot of them get to using drugs. So lots of fun stuff.
Higher rate of unexpected.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it.
Yes, that was.
Surprise! Yeah. Outcomes for these folks. Bad earnings. Considerably lower earnings than someone who's gotten a high school diploma, and a lot lower earnings than someone with a college degree or an advanced degree or a professional degree. Their access to services is diminished because of mobility, maybe, their lack of transportation, because of lack of awareness, because of lack of connectivity. They may not have a phone, they may not have an internet connection. There are any number of reasons that they have a lessened availability, a lessened access to the services that could support them, services they really need. A lot of dropouts suffer from poor health. They have bad nutrition, they may not have good, adequate housing, they may not be able to see a physician regularly, they certainly don't do a lot of preventive medicine probably, and if they're lucky, they can get to a physician when they really are ill. So health is an issue. Rates of crime and incarceration. The 2003 study showed that 75% of the inmates in state prisons were dropouts, and 59% in Fed prisons were dropouts. So dropping out is not a good thing to do. Another study showed that dropouts are 3.5 times more likely to serve time than someone who got a high school diploma. Here's some recent data from the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Stats, that looks at relative earnings and educational attainment. And it's probably kind of hard to read. It's copied off the slide. Basically, if you have less than a high school diploma, your average weekly, or sorry, the median weekly earnings in 2012 was $471. So $471 a week. If you had an associate's, it was $785. If you had a professional degree, it was 17 something, 16 something for a doctorate. So a big disparity in income. And if you look at the unemployment rates, they pretty much mirror conversely the income.
Yeah.
Unemployment was 12.4 for less than a high school degree. It was 2.1 for a professional degree. And the average was 6.8%. So dropouts definitely take a hit economically. Looking at jail stuff, because we all like jail. Percentage of 16 to 24-year-old males who were incarcerated in 2006-07, based on the educational attainment again. Of the incarcerated folks, 0.1% had a BA. High school grads and dropouts. 6.3% of the dropouts. When you look at the monetary costs to society of dropping out, a dropout contributes about $60,000 less in taxes than a graduate, which makes sense because they make a heck of a lot less money. They cost the nation about $260,000 over their lifetime, and that's from 2005. It's probably gone up a little. And that cost comes in terms of services that they need. It may come in terms of incarceration. It may come in any number of other ways. At this point, about 12 million kids will drop out over the next decade, and that's looking at the cost of the dropouts. That's about $3 trillion to the U.S. And again, that number's from 2007. It's probably a bit higher by now. So there are some fiscal costs of dropping out. It pays us to keep our kids in school. And as you all know, there's no silver bullet. There's no one thing you can do to stop dropout, to keep kids from leaving school. We wish there was, but if there was, I mean, if I knew the silver bullet, I would be a millionaire and heal dropout. How many of you have seen the IES practice guide? Has anyone seen that? It was put out by the Institute for Educational Sciences from the National Center for Educational Statistics. It was a practice guide about recommendations on what works for dropout. It was written by, among other people, the guy who used to be the head of the National Dropout Prevention Center at Clemson, Jay Smink. he and a bunch of other fairly well-respected researchers got together and talked about it, and did a variety of lit research studies, identified the level of evidence associated with a number of factors to say what really did work and what level of evidence did it have to support whatever intervention that it really was effective. And they made 6 recommendations, basically. The first of which I dearly like, is use data systems to help diagnose who's likely to drop out and the number of students who are likely to drop out. That, surprisingly, well, actually, when you think about it, not surprisingly, but that didn't have super high evidence. But the reason it didn't have so much evidence was nobody really studied it when this came out in 2008. I think people are starting to actually try to study that now, but at that point, not a heck of a lot had been done. So use data. Recommendation 2 is basically to assign adult advocates, mentors, sort of like check and connect, have somebody at the school who cares about each student, each high-risk student. The student may check in with them. The advocate will know what the student's doing, say, how are you doing with your homework, how are you doing socially, and just sort of have conversation and ongoing checking up on this kid and seeing how he or she is doing. That does have a pretty decent amount of evidence, and it seems to work. In fact, Check and Connect is, I think, the only gold standard of evidence intervention that's out there at this point. The third recommendation they gave was to provide good academic support and enrichment. So give students targeted interventions, give them things that will support them in doing the schoolwork and help them accrue the credits they need to graduate. Not rocket science, but it works. The fourth was to improve students' behavior and social skills. So give them social skills training, give them self-determination training, help support them in ways that will help them get along in school, get along in society, and be able to function in a workplace when they get out of school. Recommendation 5 is to personalize the learning environment and the instructional process. The 6th was to provide rigorous and relevant instruction and get kids engaged in learning, make them spend actually useful time learning as opposed to just sitting in the classroom and doing seat time, but basically provide them with whatever skills they really need to graduate. So when they graduate, they're not just getting a piece of paper that says, hey, this child graduated, they're getting a piece of paper that actually means that they have some useful and actual skills that they can live with. What we're doing at Goodrich, excuse me, is sort of tied into the data-based approach to school completion. As I said earlier, I've got 2 tools, our center has 2 tools that we use when we work with a school, when we go into a school. And the first is basically involves looking at building level data to figure out what sorts of needs there are in the building. How's the academic achievement? So we look at course failure rates, we look at assessment scores, we want to look at percentage of kids on track to graduate. In other words, have they accrued enough credits and done the required stuff that they would need to graduate. We would also look at attendance. Who's going to school, who's not going to school, what are the attendance rates? When you break them down by grade level, when you break them down by race, ethnicity, you break them down 9 ways to Sunday, you see who is and who is not attending school. So you would, of course, look at your dropout rate. You would disaggregate that. Who's dropping out? When are they dropping out? And you would try to identify why they were dropping out. You'd look for patterns in discipline, suspension, expulsion, in school, out of school, just general office referrals. How many times were kids sent down to the office? Were there patterns in these? Were there types of offenses that were more common than other types of offenses? What was going on that way? And then you try to figure out what sorts of universal interventions could be put in place to support all of the kids in your school. So that's kind of the large picture, the building level picture. This is a tool, a basic Excel tool that I threw together, which is way small and you don't have a chance at possibly seeing it, but it looks at graduation rate, dropout rate, attendance rates. This is a high school tool, but it's easily enough modified for middle school or another level. I've got the data split out. So IEP kids, non-IEP kids, which may not be available necessarily. Every school's got information on their kids with IEPs. Every school has information about all of the kids in the school because they're required to report that. They may not have it broken out by non-IEP kids. They could conceivably do the subtraction, but you know. So we have a school put in 3 years of back data for graduation rate, dropout rate, and attendance rate, and 3 other things which I'll show you in a sec. We have them put in the state, or if there's a local target for those things. So what's your graduation rate target? What's your dropout rate target? What's your attendance rate target? And the tool then calculates whether they met it or missed it, how far above or below they were, that target. And it does a gap also. So what's the difference in performance between kids with disabilities and all kids? And if there's a big disparity there, like your kids with disabilities aren't doing so well as all the kids, then you've got to figure out what's going on. You've got to dig deeper. So this is the top part of this giant tool. This is the bottom part. This looks at academic performance. So test scores in math and English, and it looks at office and disciplinary referrals. And that's way small, but it basically looks at the number of office referrals the kids with disabilities had, and the number of office referrals that kids without disabilities had, and the number of referrals that all kids had, and then it calculates ratios of those. So what's the ratio of the referrals for kids with IEPs to kids without IEPs? And you look for a discrepancy there. And if you're seeing that your IEP kids are getting referred to the office, getting in trouble more than non-IEP kids, you probably want to dig a little bit deeper and see what's going on, why those kids are getting referred, and what sorts of interventions you might put into place. At the student level, which is where we are at Goodrich, we recommend using an early warning system that looks at the various correlates of dropout. And it provides information on a student-by-student basis. So you can say, this child is not doing well in math, this child is not doing well attendance-wise, and you can provide whatever the appropriate intervention is to support the kid. It helps you identify kids who require the most intensive interventions and those who can benefit from less intensive interventions. This calculator has 4 levels of risk: low, medium, high, and ultra. So the kids who are at the low level basically could benefit, everybody could benefit from a universal intervention, but those kids at the top end of the scale are going to require your most intensive interventions, and those are the kids on which you have to focus some serious energy and serious interventions. And a lot of times you'll see that the kids who are at the top level are already getting some kind of an intervention or multiple interventions. If these kids are still flagged and are still doing badly, there's probably, it probably merits taking a look at what they're getting for an intervention, whether it's working, probably not, and trying to figure out why it's not working and what you might be able to replace it with, or how you might be able to modify that intervention a little bit while still being true to the implementation to help the kid. This is a shot of the risk calculator we're using in Goodrich. We've removed the kids' names because I don't need to know the kids' names, and I shouldn't know the kids' names. But we've got ID numbers. This is the roster report that the calculator prints out. It looks at academics, attendance, behavior, engagement, and a few other things. The report says whether the child has an IEP or not. If so, what's their special ed category, race, ethnicity, risk level, low, medium, high, and ultra. And then it does what I don't think any other commercially available risk calculator does. It says areas in which the student may need some help. So English, math, attendance, behavior, and engagement. So school folks can dump in the data, print this thing out, and sort by what sort of intervention the student might need, and they can group all the kids who need a math intervention, they can group all the kids who need a reading intervention, and they can ideally match those kids up with what they need. So this is what we're working on with Goodrich. And we just got the data, and we're going to share it with the Goodrich team tomorrow, which is very cool. So if you look at alterable variables, things that we can actually do something about versus those status variables that we can't change, stuff like race, ethnicity, gender, parents' level of educational attainment, that kind of thing, we can't change that. But there are things that we can focus on for these kids who are at risk. Attitudes towards school, attendance. Relatively easy in most cases to change attendance patterns. Academic performance, as in course pass and failure rates. Retention rates. Retention is a big killer in terms of dropout. Kids who have been retained once have, I'll never remember the stat, but it's something like a 30 or 40% higher likelihood of dropping out than kids who have not been retained. And if they've been retained twice, it's something like 60 or 70% likelihood of dropping out. So it just kills kids. We can alter behavior. We can alter participation in extracurricular activities and other things that would improve engagement. And we can work on parental and family engagement. These are things that we can actually actively change to support these kids.
No.
Among the things we can do to support kids is provide support to attend class and stay focused. So engagement stuff and attendance. Academic supports like direct individual tutoring, homework help, math labs, having math coaches, English coaches, reading coaches. Participation in vocational education. CTE makes a big difference. Not at the middle school probably, but at high school it certainly does make a big difference. Kids who are involved in those like it, they're more engaged, and they tend to do better than kids who are not. Having community-based work experiences is really nice. It gives the kid experience outside of school. It exposes them to possible careers they might like. Sometimes it earns them some money, which never hurts. So engagement is a good thing to focus on. Use school-wide measures to make school as engaging, relevant, and interesting and enjoyable to everybody as you can. Get kids actively interested in school, get them that feeling of belonging in the school community, get them some school spirit, the old school spirit term, but get them involved, and having them participate in activities and relate well with their peers and like the school goes a long way to keeping them in school. Family component is pretty important. And it's often hard to connect with families and get families engaged. There are a variety of ways to do this. We've got a training montage or something Reese should probably put into our piece as a family engagement module. But that's pretty critical. One thing we've also found is if a school can reach out to local businesses and local community organizations, those agencies and organizations can help support students in school. They can provide a place for a kid to work, potentially. They can maybe provide some incentives for attendance programs. They can basically help support that student. So have support coming not just from the school, but from the community members and from the businesses in the community. If you have larger employers in your town, conceivably, they can provide some internship or work programs for kids to actually spend some time learning a career, learning what the workplace is like, and learning new skills, learning job skills, and maybe making some extra money. A lot of schools don't realize it, but some of their policies basically are push factors. A lot of attendance policies tend to push kids out of school. Tying attendance rates to credit accrual, tying attendance rates to participation in sports is pretty common. A lot of kids go to school because they like playing sports, and that may be the only reason they go to school. And if they don't attend school, you take away their sports, and lo and behold, they've lost the reason they like to go to school. Or if you tie participation in a job program to attendance, a lot of times you take that away, they'll drop out of school. So looking at the policies that could be pushing kids out of school is definitely a hard activity. It's one we recommend to schools, but very often the people we're working with are school teams. So they're teachers and counselors and fairly low-level people in the school. They don't have the power to change that. we try to reach their administrators and say, look, you need to take a very hard look at your policies and think about their potential impact on school completion, because there can be pretty bad, large and bad impact. When schools do professional development, they need to make sure that it's based on actual staff needs. A lot of times somebody will have a pet thing that they really like, and they'll do a bunch of professional development on that pet thing, and lo and behold, it really isn't particularly useful to the staff. So figuring out what staff needs really are and addressing those in professional development is a good way of supporting your school, supporting your students and your teachers. Talking to kids is never bad. They know what they want from school. They know what would make them more interested, more engaged. They know what will make it easier for them to come to school. Lindy and the department are working on re-engagement and re-entry into school, getting kids back in after they've dropped out of school. One of the critical things is providing flexible programs, things that will let people who are out of school actually come back into school. And those things may be daycare, they may be flexible hours, so having night school or Saturday school. It may be a credit recovery sort of thing, like a computer-based curriculum or some courses they can take on computer and earn those credits, because most of these kids are credit deficient. But any way you can think of to make it easier for someone who's a dropout to come back in is going to help. And one good way to find out what those ways are is to ask dropouts. So we recommend surveying your dropouts. We've got a survey that we've developed and shared with a number of schools and districts and states. And it's a phone-based thing, so somebody from the school will call. They've got a roster of dropouts. They'll call the dropouts and run through this, say, would you be willing to talk to us? And among the questions are, why did you drop out of school? What did we do? Was there something we did that pushed you out of school, or did something pull you out of school? What could we have done to make you stay in school? What did you like about school? What did you hate about school? Would you think about coming back if the door were open, which it is, by the way? What could we do to get you back in school? And you would be surprised how much you can learn about how to tailor your programs to your audience's needs by talking to these folks. Having a 4-year or a 2-year school nearby and partnering with them can provide your current students with opportunities to earn some dual credit, college credit as well as high school credit, exposes them to higher education, gets them interested perhaps. If they're bored in the classroom in high school, this gives them a chance to get some higher material. And does seem to work fairly well. Dual enrollment is something that we've seen in South Carolina in a couple of schools, particularly in the community college system. They're doing pretty well with that. Washington State, there are a number of states that are doing that and finding it pretty effective. Let's see, exploring meaningful employment. Yeah, that's definitely good. Improving curriculum and instruction, so all students get the same high quality learning opportunities, whether they're students with or without disabilities. I mentioned before, reading and math labs to support those kids who are having troubles in reading and math. Providing credit recovery programs, whether they're after school human-based programs or they're computer-based programs. That's a strategy that definitely has some merit. Because basically kids who are likely to drop out or who have dropped out are so credit deficient that if they just went back to school in a regular manner, they probably still wouldn't be able to graduate in 4 or 5 or 6 years. A lot of the kids who do end up going back to school end up getting discouraged because it's very hard to earn all those credits that they need. If they dropped out with 5 credits and they needed, what's your requirement here? Is there a standard?
It varies.
It varies,
It varies,
so
okay.
it's hard to tell.
30-something credits?
Yeah.
Or, yeah. If you drop out and you got 5 credits, you've got a heck of a long hill to climb in order to actually graduate. So anything like that that will help them recover credits is good. When kids transfer from one school to another, one district to another, a lot of the problems that they run into, in some states at least, not all states, is that an English class is not an English class. English 1 may not be English 1 in the next county over.
That's Nebraska.
Math, yeah, okay. So it's a problem. If there's a way to standardize what English 1 means, what math, algebra 1 means, from school to school, that's good. If you can standardize grading systems, you know, A+, B+, A, B, 1, 2, 3, 4, try to get a uniform grading system. Having that kind of disparity makes it really hard when a child transfers from one school to another.
Yeah, yeah.
Because they thought they only needed, 1 semester left to graduate, and they get to the new school, and it's like, what do you mean? I have to go back to school for another year and a half, or for another whole year, instead of that 1 semester. That happens a fair amount,
Yeah.
and it certainly pushes kids out of school.
Mhm.
I mean, it's not good for kids at all. Retention policies,
Does it?
a lot of times it's better to remediate and intervene with a young child rather than hold them back, retain them 1 year, because as I said earlier, retention is very predictive of dropout. So rather than hold that kid back, provide whatever supports you can, provide intensive tutoring, math, English, whatever help that kid needs to be promoted legitimately to the next grade, and you'll do them a huge service, much better than thinking, oh, we'll retain them and they'll do that year over and they'll do better. No, they won't. If you make a kid do the same grade twice in a row and you don't provide any sort of extra supports or interventions, why do you think the kid's going to do any differently than he or she did the first time around? They're not. If anything, they may do worse because they're just discouraged. And it's like, I hated this the first time, here we go again. Providing wraparound services is pretty good to help kids stay in school. Because, yeah, school subjects are not the only reason that kids drop out. They may need various other supports, be they mental health, be they counseling. I mean, there are all sorts of things that can support a kid in staying in school, and it's not just school subjects. One thing that very often is ignored when schools start doing a dropout prevention or a school completion initiative is making sure that they implement whatever their interventions are in the right way. Fidelity of implementation is pretty critical. And if staff are not trained on how to do a particular intervention, they're not likely to do it right. So there's got to be stress on fidelity of implementation, doing it right, doing it consistently, keeping track of what you're doing, and getting good data. But it does take a lot of training. And that's something, given that budgets are getting slashed and people have less and less money, school systems have less and less money with which to work, very often professional development is suffering. And if you're going to do good, high-quality, research-based interventions, you need to make sure that there's adequate professional development to support those, to support the faculty and staff in understanding what they're doing, why they're doing it, how it works, and how to do it the right way. So those are pretty much key things. Another thing that's very key is to keep track, when you're doing an intervention like this, is keep track of data. And I know we all have way too much data, but in order to see what sort of success you've had, you need to know where you started. You need a baseline piece of data, and you need to collect data at pretty regular intervals as you go through whatever intervention you're doing to see what progress you're making or what progress you're not making. And if you're not making progress, you need to obviously look at what you're doing. Are you implementing with fidelity? Are you doing it correctly? Is there something that you can change a little bit so the intervention works better? But you need that feedback to see how you're doing, and also to be able to share with your stakeholders, with your principal, with your school board, with your parents, with whomever, to say, hey, here's what we did. We're applying for this grant. Here's why. We moved our dropout rate. We were at Northeast High School today, and they've got a dropout prevention grant. They said that they'd improved their dropout rate by, I believe it was 10% in 2 years.
A little bit more than 2 years.
A little bit more than 2 years, okay. But they had baseline data, they had regular data. Oh, I'm sorry, graduation rate. But they're doing it right. Basically, you need to keep track of what you're doing, how you're doing it, so you can show what you've done and celebrate your success and having done it right. So in terms of other stuff to look at, there's our website. There's the website of the National Dropout Prevention Center, which is our parent, essentially. They wrote a Fed grant that got us in business. NSTAC is the National Secondary Transition Technical Assistance Center. They do secondary transition. They're one of our big partners, and we'll probably all be on the same grant at some point. There's Post-School Outcomes Center, there's PBIS, and there are a number of other nice resources there that can provide interventions, can provide information about data, how to use data, IDEA data. If you like looking at data and you're curious about what the dropout rate is, or what the graduation rate is, or what any other IDEA collected piece of data is, that's the mother of all IDEA data. You can find back years worth of data. I think they're running it back as far as 2002 or 3 at this point. So that's a good resource. And there are a number of other things. And if you have questions or ever want to get a hold of me, email is the best way. I'm at Clemson. And I may take a couple days to answer an email because I travel a lot, but I will certainly respond to your emails if you have questions.
Yeah, thank you very much.